Well, welcome everybody. We're glad you're with us today, and we're looking forward to a conversation today on John Cobb's new book. There are three people with us. John is with us, as of course you can see him, and also Jen Strickland and Jacob Buchholz. Now, my name is Jay McDaniel, and I'll simply be facilitating this meeting, but I'm just delighted to be with these three folks. I'll say a word about John Cobb shortly, but I'd like you to know a little bit about Jen and Jacob. I've got their biographies in front of me, and it's just so interesting. Let me just read a bit to you. So Jen holds degrees from Miami University, Bachelor's of Creative Writing and Mass Communications, Chapman University, the dual Master of Fine Arts in English Literature and Creative Writing, Princeton Theological Seminary, Master of Divinity, and Duke University, a Doctor of Divinity. She grew up in a UCC church, was ordained in the Presbyterian Church, and now has dual standing in both denominations. Having previously served at churches in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Liberty, Ohio, Prairie Village, Kansas, and Lincoln, Nebraska, she's passionate about incorporating creativity, art, and fresh liturgy in worship, connecting people of faith and fellowship, and teaching the rich stories of the Christian faith to disciples of all ages. Jacob received his bachelor's in the comparative study of religion at Harvard University, his master's of divinity at Princeton Theological Seminary, where he and Jen were classmates, and his doctor of divinity in Christian leadership at Duke Divinity School. He grew up in a deaf family, and during seminary started a deaf church conducted entirely in American Sign Language. Jen and Jacob then moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, where Jacob served at First Plymouth Congregational Church until they received their call to serve as co-pastors of the Claremont United Church of Christ. Now, they were married in Iceland in 2014, and people often ask, why Iceland? And they say, well, why not? And that's their spirit. They're open to fresh possibilities, to surprise. That's who they are. They have two beloved rescue dogs. You may hear one or the other bark, and a rescue potbelly pig named Zuzu. They consider themselves church nerds who eat, sleep, and breathe all things church. And we're glad to have them with us today because we want, at some point in our conversation, to really test out the ideas that are proposed by John Cobb in his book, Salvation, Jesus' Faith, Jesus' Mission, and Ours. It's a provocative book, and the purpose of this gathering is to discuss the book, but we're also wondering, would those ideas work in a church? Could a church be saved? Not in the sense of personal immortality after death, although that may be a good thing, but in the sense of becoming whole through giving itself to the very mission in our way, in our time, to which Jesus gave himself in his way, in his time. And that's what's meant by salvation in John's book. John is 95 years old. He's written approximately 50 books. He keeps saying that this is his last one, that his last 7 books have been his last books. So no one quite believes him in any of this. So we're just not going to even say that this is his last book, but it's his most recent book. And he's at a time in his life when he's getting down to the basics of who he is as a Christian theologian and what he wants to be about and what he wants to recommend to people. And that's what this book is about. Now, we've had a few technical difficulties here, and one of them happens to be that John's camera is upside down. Now, John's not upside down, but he has to hold the camera in order for us to see his face. So let us be patient and gentle. If he wiggles a little bit, that's his hand wiggling because he's holding that camera. Here's how we'll proceed. We've asked John to tell us about his book. What are the most important ideas? What led to writing it? Whatever he wants to say for about 20 minutes. And then Jen and Jacob will ask him any questions they want to ask him about that, have a little give and take. And then I'm going to turn to Jen and Jacob and basically ask questions on how preachable, how usable, how translatable are the ideas in John's book to a local congregation. So again, and then there will be time for questions from everybody and conversation with everybody. So we'll have some open discussion too toward the end. But first things first, let's hear from John. Let's hear about this book. John, thank you. Glad to have you. Glad to have you, Jen and Jacob as well.
Well, I will try, since I'm assuming not everybody has even seen the book, just to say what it's about. Everything I say is controversial. Whoops, have I disappeared?
You're with us.
Oh, okay. I can't see myself any longer.
You're with us.
Oh, I see. I was looking up at the top.
Mm-hmm.
You folks can tell I'm not really a part of this century, but okay. My view of Jesus is controversial, and my understanding of how to relate to Jesus is controversial, but I'm not going to keep saying, I think. I'll just present it as if it were the truth. Okay, so Jesus announced his purpose, or at least all the synoptic gospels say, that he understood his mission to be proclaiming that what we usually translate as the kingdom of God. In Greek, it's basileia tou theo, and I like to call it the divine commonwealth, and so I'm just going to stick with that term, that the divine commonwealth is at hand. And what does that mean? I think it means that it is possible for people, individually or as groups, to actually live in the divine commonwealth now. But what we are all really concerned about is that the divine commonwealth take over, that it become the dominant reality. And in the Lord's Prayer, of course, the very first petition is, may the divine commonwealth come. And we are told immediately in the second line that that for the divine commonwealth to come means that God's will be done on earth. And then we are told that for that to happen, that would mean that everybody's fundamental needs are met. It's just bread is the only thing mentioned, but bread is the most fundamental need of people in those days. In other parts of the world, it would have been rice, but it doesn't matter. The point is, when God's will is done on earth, all the basic needs of everybody will be met. In the Lord's Prayer, we always, in the plural, we never ask for something for our individual selves. It's always our Father and our bread, okay? And then that all debts will be erased. I think the Jubilee is what is in mind in the prayer, and this is the end of the debt system. And the debt system has been with humanity for a long, long time. But that economy is not the economy of the Lord's Prayer or of the one that would happen if God's will were really done. So we do have some clues there, and many of the sayings of Jesus have to do with divine commonwealth. So we're not completely blank as to what is meant by the divine commonwealth, but it's not simply that God's will be done, but we know that God's will is for a certain kind of world to exist. And we know also from Jesus that he thought you could not serve both God and wealth. And it's fairly obvious to me that the United States serves wealth and not God. Now, that means that following Jesus is to be countercultural. And that's where the big question arises as to whether it would be possible for a local church to be genuinely countercultural. And I'm not at all sure. So I'm just saying, I think it's a good topic. But in the book, I don't discuss that. The book is not about the church. It's just about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. Now, Jesus lived in a time when what the people of Israel wanted was freedom from Rome. It was part of the Roman Empire. And there had already been revolts. The Jews had succeeded in establishing their independence under the Maccabees for a while. And they thought God was responsible for that, and that God might help them again. And of course, they were looking for a Messiah who would establish that independence. Jesus thought or understood, I think it's more than just thinking, he knew that military revolt against Rome would always be put down. And if they continued, it would be the end of Israel. And of course, that happened. There were 2 revolts after the time of Jesus, and in the end, the Romans just dispersed the people of Israel and ended there being any kind of a Jewish nation. And that lasted until our day, when finally the Jews reestablished themselves in Israel. That's a long time. Anyway, that was a very, very serious question. And the Zealots wanted to fight, and of course other people wanted just to compromise with Rome. And Jesus wanted them to transform the relationship to Rome, but not to use military force against Rome. And so he was calling for what we might these days call a nonviolent revolt. And he thought that if the Jews really loved all those whom God loves, that means very explicitly, if they loved their enemies, that meant if they loved the Romans, this would transform the situation so that though the empire might survive, it would not have the oppressive character that it did. So my understanding is that Jesus thought the most important issue at his time was not how literally and completely Jews obeyed the laws, their own law, or that they were politically independent, but it was to transform the relationship between Jews and Romans so that they could have a continuing life in collaboration with in acceptance of the overall situation. Well, that situation, of course, was just a very specific situation in Israel at that time. And as a process theologian, I think the mission changes. And it changed dramatically with Paul. Jesus did not succeed in persuading the Jewish people as a whole to follow his way of love, and love also for the enemy. That's a very important point. He's very explicit that that's what distinguishes what he's talking about from what other people talked about. But so in that sense it failed, but there were many people, probably thousands, who did enter the kingdom. They created communities in which people really took care of each other. Everyone who came into the community was accepted. And this was the feature of Jesus' work that was continued and vastly expanded after his death. And Paul presided over or was looked to as leader over many of these communities in the Roman Empire. And in those communities, there was a spirit. Now, I think it's not hard to understand that there was a kind of spirit, special spirit, if it's a little dangerous to do something. So to go to church was already risky, at times extremely risky. And if you go there and are finding there a possibility that simply hasn't existed in your life before, there's a spirit at work. So for Paul, the Holy Spirit played a primary role, and I think it was the spirit of the church. The church associated it with the presence of Jesus, it associated it with the presence of God, but there was no doubt about the importance of Christianity. Well, I'm not going to go through this history, but in every epoch, the situation is different, the possibilities are different. And when Christianity becomes the dominant power and is allied with the empire, following Jesus becomes, whether simply doing what the church can do is an adequate following of Jesus is questionable. I think many of us feel that St. Francis is the model of following Jesus in a time when Christianity is fully established. And as an individual, it was possible. Well, I felt like today we have a situation somewhat analogous to Jesus' situation. For Jesus, it was the survival of the Jewish nation that was at stake. For us, it is the survival of the human race that is at stake. That's not all that's at stake, but it's a very important part of what is at stake. And it seems to me that if one is looking for how the application of the same basic principles would operate for us, that we would say saving the world from its self-destruction is analogous for us to saving Israel from destruction by the Jews, that is, by revolting against Rome. So my argument is that the mission of the church today, what corresponds, we can say, the divine commonwealth, is at hand. We want to save the world. We want to prevent the horrors that it's too late now to prevent. But we can certainly make a difference as to how drastic they are. But in the meantime, we also can create, and in fact, I think the main thing we can do is to create communities of people who really are radically countercultural. And so that's what the book is about. And I have put it in terms, I have not put it in terms of the church. So that's a new conversation that Jay has organized for today. I will say one other thing. It's distressing to me, and I expect to all of us involved in it at this time, that the liberal church, and liberal meaning, first of all, the church that is no longer committed to things which really are wrong, either untrue or unwise, that the liberal church is dying. But we need to recognize that is the case. When I ask why it is dying, I think the fundamental reason is that its message is not very important. The church in general functions in ways that other communities function. And it's a good community. This is not a matter of the church not doing, of the liberal church not doing good things. But when you ask, well, what is the church doing that you can't get without going to church? The answer becomes very difficult. So whereas for nearly 2,000 years, people have thought that the church was the place that was involved in the salvation that mattered. That's just no longer the case. I look at I'll just talk about my oldest son, and he had a good experience growing up in the church. He liked it. He still likes it. Whenever he's in Claremont, he wants to go back to it. But he doesn't see any reason to join a church anywhere else. He can do the things that he thinks are really important as well, maybe better, in other contexts. So I feel like we're probably not really following Jesus very well, when the best we can say is we don't do any harm and we don't believe those foolish things that people used to mistakenly believe, and we're nice to each other and we welcome you. That's not really a challenge to young people. I think if we can say that we are committed to saving the world in a way that Jesus was committed to saving Israel, and we're serious about it, and we really organize our lives as in the community along those lines, the church would be important. Now, lots of people would leave it, but not out of boredom or not out of nonchalance. And so in that sense, I do think that the message is what I said is relevant to the church today. I haven't timed myself, Jay, but I think that's about enough.
I think that'll get us started, John. That's great. And I'd like to ask Jen and Jacob first, before we turn to the question of implications for a local congregation, are there general kinds of questions or responses that you would like to offer John at this point? Please do.
Yeah, well, John, it's such a pleasure to be here this morning and talking with you. Certainly, we are so impressed with your career and your breadth of work and thought, and we're just really excited to enter into this conversation with you. So thank you for this book, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about it. The thing that really struck me the most about this is, first of all, just the title, Salvation. And what you're talking about is something that is so needed in progressive Christian churches today. We have talked about this a lot in the last few years, that a lot of progressive Christians have moved past, or at least grappling with, atonement theory, this idea of salvation, this idea that Jesus died for our sins. That's a complicated thought for people who are moving beyond the traditional understanding of what that even means. And as pastors, it's a very complicated conversation to try and offer an alternative to traditional atonement theories and to the traditional idea of what salvation means, this afterlife existence in which the slate is wiped clean and all of that type of language. And so I think your book is offering a really powerful alternative way of understanding salvation and giving language to so many thoughts that progressive Christians are having about that alternative. So I'm really excited to engage in this today and talk about ways that Christians have another way of expressing their faith in Christ and his mission, and how that really is our mission today.
What I really like about the book, too, is that you establish that this, as you said, is not written for Christianity. It's not written for the church, but it's written for Christians. And I feel like you've taken a lot of your former work and you've put it into language that someone who considers themselves a disciple of Jesus or an aspiring disciple of Jesus can pick the book up and read it and feel as if they're being called to that mission of saving the world, or what you call creating an ecological civilization. I think the role of the church is to mobilize disciples or to inspire disciples. So I would love to talk a little bit more in a minute here about what it means for the church to mobilize people for that mission. But first, I think we'd love to hear from you. You've used the term ecological civilization from some of your earliest writings, and you're bringing that into perspective here, that disciples of Jesus need to pursue that right now. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, throughout your career, what progress have we made toward achieving an ecological civilization? What do you think we've gotten right in these years? What have we gotten wrong in these years? But could you create a baseline on where you think we are on a process towards achieving ecological civilization?
Well, we are a long, long, long way from achieving it. But some things have happened recently. By recently, I mean the last century or two. I think there are more Christians who understand that to be a Christian is not to believe what is unbelievable, or to try to feel guilty because you don't share certain opinions that you really don't share and shouldn't share. And so I think that that's a plus. And I think the social gospel was a breakthrough. I'm a child of the social gospel, so I'm a little biased. Looking back, we can see there were all kinds of things left out. We don't want to go back to what was the social gospel in the first half of the century and the end of the first half of the last century. But the idea that, they noticed that Jesus understood his mission in terms of bringing into being the what I'm calling the divine commonwealth. And so we know that churches can live that way. It was a rather healthy period in the life of the churches, I think. So it's not, in that sense, not impossible. But it was the understanding of what would be required was much less than we know has to be required. They did not know that humanity was committing suicide. It really wasn't, and it hadn't gone far enough for that language to be meaningful. And they did not think that what was required was as radically countercultural. The culture has become much more obsessed with wealth and much less interested in humane values. You see it in the higher education very dramatically. When I went to college, I would have been, it might have been true. It wasn't in my case, but there may be some people who went to college so they could get a better job. But one would be hesitant to say that publicly. One went to college so that one would be able to be a better leader. One went to college so that one would understand the tradition better and be able to apply it. One could be more helpful in the cultural range. All kinds of reasons could be given, sometimes very strongly and expressly Christian, but not necessarily. But today, something like 95% or more, I think it's actually more than that, of new college students, when asked why they came to college, it will be to get a better job. Money has taken over, and higher education has become organized in terms of academic disciplines which seek to be value-free. The book whose title I think is very significant and is widely accepted in higher education says, "Save the world on your own time." That's written to college professors. your job is not to help save the world. Your job is to increase the information that we have in whatever specialty you have announced yourself in. So though the change in the culture has gone in diametrically the opposite direction. I don't mean to be saying we were wonderful in the 19th century. We look back and we see all kinds of problems. But we have made these gains at the same time. In my view, Gandhi and Martin Luther King showed that Jesus' call to love the enemy can have wonderful historical consequences. It's not, I mean, no one taught, I mean, I think St. Francis implied that. But basically, the church made no serious effort to get people to love the enemy for a long, long period of time. And then Gandhi's breakthrough was amazing, and we can build on it. I'm trying to say there are some things that had. Martin Luther King, I think even more remarkably, I would say even came close at one point to making such an advance that I would say really bringing the divine commonwealth into being. His transformation of the global understanding of race is just an amazing achievement for one human being. But I think, of course, with help, no one does anything alone. But, and then when he recognized that simply changing attitudes toward race and laws about race is not enough. There's also the problem of poverty, and there's also the problem of war. And his organizing the Poor Man's March on Washington, well, in my view, Johnson didn't want it, and he was assassinated. But whether you accept the official story that a lone gunman who hadn't much reason to do it did the whole thing, and no one else shares in any guilt. It doesn't, I mean, that doesn't matter. I mean, he was not able to carry through that move. But if he had really made the immense breakthrough in relation to poverty and war that he had made in relationship to race, oh, we would be so much closer. So these are things that have happened, that there are many, many people, I would say a high percentage of people in liberal churches who are relatively free from being boxed into dogma as being the important part of being a Christian. We have historical examples of what it means to follow Jesus for both Gandhi and King. That was what they were doing. They were listening to Jesus and trying to implement it. So these are pluses that we mustn't ignore. They heighten the understanding that they behaved counterculturally, but managed to turn what was countercultural into what was widely accepted. And many liberals, you see, to be liberal often just means be very open to what you think is the best thinking of your day. And if the best thinking of the day is represented in universities, then we're in real trouble, because universities are essentially nihilistic in what they teach. So the celebration of universities as being valuable institutions is very, very common in the liberal church, and it's totally misdirected. Well, you can see you punch a button and you get more than you want. But
oh, that's helpful. That's great. So you mentioned some of the problems, the issues of the church today, and on page 31, you talk about this concept of a new theology that came onto the scene that you call Christianism.
Yes.
You talk about supporting the political and even military strength of the institution replaced serving humanity as discipleship to Jesus. In some churches, being Christian was doing the things that would gain God's approval and get you into heaven. The church morphed into an institution that could assist people in going to heaven rather than to hell. I think all of that is true historically. Are there ways that you see this Christianism, still coming into the church and seeping into the church today that is slightly different from the historical part that you talk about?
Perhaps even related to today's political.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Let me interrupt right here just to see if we can get John to get the camera back on his face.
Oh, okay.
All right. So you heard their question, John?
Yes,
Can you
yes.
respond? Good.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
I think responding to it by saying that the Republican Party has tried to identify the Christianists and to please them, and they don't do it by behaving in anything that anybody could call a Christian way. I haven't understood why that was so unimportant, but supporting Christianity and whatever Christianity happens to teach has become more important for some segment of our society. But I really don't think that in the liberal church that's too much of a problem. The liberal church has a lot of people in it who are not very sure Christianity is a very good thing anyway. So that's rather at the opposite extreme from Christianism. So that's one of the gains. I think in the liberal church we are relatively free from otherworldliness, and we are relatively, it depends. But in many liberal churches, I think we're relatively free from legalism, which has been another besetting problem of the church. I think there are lots of people who understand that love is the most important thing. Those are all good, but many of those people make no application to what's going on in the world. And by our silence and indifference, and I think we would say the great majority of people in liberal churches, they're a source of authority with respect to what happens in the world is the New York Times. And the New York Times belongs to Wall Street. And the New York Times supports American empire. And American empire is about as opposite. I mean, that's saying we're following Rome and not Jesus. And that is so common. I'm so pained. You have to go hunt up the sources to understand what we are doing right now to Iran, to the people of Bolivia, to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and all the fact that the New York Times fully participates in all the lies about Russia and China. So I can't just speak of gain. When I was growing up in the South, the church women were well educated, and they've been well educated by the church. They knew more about what was going on in the rest of the world than 99% of the people in the United States today. That was because the women's societies tried to teach women about Christianity and apply it to the world. That was the social gospel, was the lay behind that. But it was very interesting to me that the women in Georgia were ready for integration. The men were not, because the men didn't get educated. And it was sort of almost funny in Atlanta that when the Atlanta restaurants were going to integrate, the men said, "We will boycott them." The women said, "We won't." And of course, the women won, and the men just looked foolish. I won't go on, but I'm trying to say the church has in the past been a source of education about the realities of what's going on in the world. But what's going on in the world, what the United States is doing in the world is utterly vicious. Maybe Trump is educated as some. The Democrats just conceal it. So there's so much that we have to overcome. We cannot, if we are supporting empire in the church, and we do so by our silence more than by positive actions, that's not following Jesus.
Wow, thank you, John.
Yes.
That's very powerful. It ties into what you wrote in chapter 4. That chapter is entitled The Fading of Historical Consciousness.
Yes.
And so what I'm hearing from you is that there's very much a role for the church to be part of educating people, to have this historical knowledge that allows us not to fall prey towards serving country, towards serving ideology, towards serving nationalism, and that we won't get that sort of education from other sources if the church doesn't play a role in it.
That's what's happened. The church has ceased to play a role, and nobody else. There are people who have picked it up, but you have to hunt around on on your web in order to find the few sources which are still telling the truth about what's happening in the world.
That's great.
Yeah.
A major part of the church and the role that it can play then in establishing some sort of divine commonwealth seems to be an articulation of the mission of Jesus Christ and making that very clear. And what we're saying is that the sort of Christianism or the other things that we pander to can get in the way of articulating that mission. It makes me think a little bit, some of the doctoral work I did was on the concept of servant leadership, that as Christians, we lead through service, but sometimes what we serve are we pander to the needs of people that they don't understand are not the ultimate mission of Jesus Christ. And that as leaders in the church, sometimes we have to take a greater role in firing people, staff and lay volunteers, if they're so focused on trying to uphold their own sense of decorum or their own sense of Christianity or Christianese rather than being devoted to the mission of Christ. Do you think if a local church can be involved in establishing what that mission is, articulating it, inviting people into it? You mentioned in your book that we might be able to create some sort of what you call an island of ecological civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Is that enough? Do you think that should be our ultimate goal as church leaders, is to create a little island of ecological civilization, or do we need to do something beyond that?
Well, I think we need to aim at a global change. But I think that the global change, I think that the best contribution, other than presenting broad information, the best contribution is to create communities that actually live by that change. So it's not an either or. If you only tell people, oh, you'll be in trouble if you don't do X, Y, and Z, you are not following Jesus. But if you say, let's do all we can to bring into being the kind of global commonwealth that we're talking about, and one of the ways is to actually practice it in our more immediate connections, but we also need to try to get a third party going in this country that is not totally committed to both neoliberalism and neoconservatism. I think, one of the big problems of doing that, for the church is that it is committed to being nonpartisan, and that's sort of understood. It's committed to not discussing the most important issues, the ones on which the lives of billions of people depend. And if we're afraid we will lose our tax deductible status, and that we have to be willing to give up tax deductible status.
Mm.
In other words, as long as we think the first concern is not to offend anybody, not to lose any of our present members by taking a stand on something that they don't agree with. And then secondly, we mustn't do anything that could affect our economics situation. We can't even move. I mean, we can still do lots of good things. I keep wanting people to understand. I think that our churches do lots of good things. But I was very interested that our Methodist Church got lots of publicity for having the courage to denounce one particularly vicious, immoral policy of separating families at the border. I mean, why not? Of course we should denounce that. But it was a great surprise to so many people that a church would get involved in anything like that. That's so at the fringes of what we need to be talking about.
Right.
So I have been discouraged by the distance between, and I'm a devoted member of the Claremont United Methodist Church. I'm a charter member of it. So I assure you, I'm not holding it up as a bad example. I'm holding it up as a good example of what's been happening. But whereas under our first pastor, we could discuss the Vietnam War, and I think we did it in a very good way and so forth, I don't think any other minister has wanted to tackle controversial aspects of American policy.
Mm. We have some great stories of people calling our church in response to the Methodist Church's nativity scene, because both churches start with Claremont United Church of.
Okay.
And we were getting all of these phone calls of so-called Christians who were outraged by this and leaving terribly angry, aggressive messages. And when we would politely interrupt their rant and say, actually, you're calling about the Methodist Church down the street, this is Claremont United Church of Christ, they would change their tone and say, oh, God bless you, have a Merry Christmas, I'm so sorry. So we got to see some really interesting characters come out of the woodwork.
Yeah. So it's not easy for a church, because you don't want to lose what members you got.
Right.
Yeah, you're right that churches can do a lot of good, but there's a lot of temptation to divert ourselves away from the ultimate mission.
Right.
Yes, I think so.
And so those temptations are present. And so I think we could maybe shift a little bit in discussing the local church itself. Jay, you had prepared some great questions for the forum today to help us delve into this idea of whether a local church can be saved. Would you like to explore those?
Well, I would. And so I think that what you've heard from John and so far is yes to Jesus and no to Americanism and its many idolatries in which we all participate. And so this led me to wonder, really, what would it look like for a local congregation to take John's book really seriously? What would that look like? And I don't want to presuppose that that's your congregation, but I think you have such experience that you could help us think through that question. And so I kind of have two questions right now, and they can sound or a little theoretical, but I don't mean them to be. But the churches that I'm familiar with, this can sound funny to say, but we do have beliefs about Jesus. But I'm not sure that we have a commitment to actually following Jesus. You know, it's enough to say nice things about Jesus, really nice things, like he's the sole source of my salvation. But that's a little different from saying, I want to share in his journey and walk in his footsteps in my way and my time. So kind of my first question to you is, how important is Jesus and following in his footsteps in the actual lives of your congregants, or would you like for it to be?
Yeah, that's a many layered question. So at Duke Divinity School, we studied under Will Willimon, and he has this great story of teaching the story of the young ruler, which I think, John, you mentioned in your book as well, and this idea that when asked, well, I've done everything, I've followed all your teachings, what else is there to do to truly become your full-fledged disciple? And Jesus says, sell all your possessions and donate the money to the poor. And the man says, oh, that's crossing the line, I can't do that. And Will Willimon talks about how he was teaching that story in a classroom, and one of his students raised his hand and said, well, what if Jesus really meant that? And Will Willimon was like, oh, no, it's just a story. Like, we're not supposed to actually do that. But then he was really convicted about, like, what does that mean for us today if Jesus really did mean that? And so I think that's a good question, and something that kind of pushed the church in that spot of tension. There's this pressure to, give into some aspects of economy and empire, in the sense that, you often hear the phrase, the church is a business, the church has to be able to pay its bills and keep the lights on in order to do ministry. And yet sometimes the ways in which we ensure that we can pay our bills and keep our lights on is making sure that we never cross into a territory that will offend people and turn people away from our doors. And so I think the church does walk in that space of tension. I wonder if a way forward in really embodying Jesus's teachings, at least this is what we try to do at Claremont UCC, is we talk a lot about putting your faith into action. So finding a biblical grounding for the reasons why we do what we do, and then pushing one another and encouraging one another to now go out and do that thing that we just talked about and preached about and taught and studied. It's one thing to have that foundational understanding of Christ's teachings, and it's the second part of that is learning how we can actually implement that. And that's often the really difficult part for well-meaning, educated, progressive Christians. We understand the importance of it. We understand the biblical rooting of Christ's teaching, and we understand how that might even be lived out today. But how do we do it? Right?
Right. And I think that there's a role that Jesus can play in sort of helping people put their faith into action. I think we all know there's a decrease in denominationalism within our country, that people aren't as integrally affiliated with their denominations. And so a lot of times we have people who are visiting our church who might consider themselves ex-evangelicals or ex-Catholics. They're looking for a place where they can explore faith in a way that does deal with immigration and does push back against empire and talks about poverty and talks about hunger and gets involved with Black Lives Matter. And they want their faith to allow them to talk openly about those issues. And what they don't know is that there is a Jesus whose words speak directly to those things. They're not coming to United Church of Christ because they know that the UCC is maybe a progressive or liberal denomination. They have no idea what it means. They don't even know our church is called that. They might see the rainbow flag on the side of our building, wander in and wonder, is this a space where what I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing and the current events I'm seeing on the news, is this a place that speaks to those issues? And perhaps if we as church leaders, when we ask them to put their faith into action, can say, well, here's a man, Jesus, who talks about this and talks about it openly and talks about it directly and doesn't care what the powers of the world think. And we want you to follow this person. And our mission, will be to follow this person as a church. And that's the most important thing we want you to do here. And I think that even helps. You say we're trying to walk that tightrope. But I think we can walk that more easily if we say, this is the path Jesus is taking, and we're going to follow him down that path wherever it might take us. What do you think about that, John? Would that be how you describe Jesus? Here's this person who speaks about these issues you care about, and let's just follow him. Maybe people will be offended by it, but we're not trying to be political or serve the nation. We're trying to follow this Jesus who has something to say about it.
Of course, it's very important to have historical consciousness so that one is realistic in the way one translates the Samaritan into the contemporary scene. I mean, I think I don't need to say that to you. I'm sure you're working with that all the time. But it's to understand history deeply is to understand that history is made up of unrepeatable events. Our universities, the science city finds itself as being interested only in repeatable events. And unfortunately, they think that those are the only ones that matter. So history is sort of disappearing from the curriculum of science of the universities. But if we really understand that what we are interested in are primarily the unrepeatable events, then you're not trying to repeat Jesus, but to follow him needs a deeper understanding. And I've tried to get at that kind of thing in the book. Yeah. So I don't think, I'm not saying that because I'm afraid you wouldn't do it, but there are people who have a little too literal-minded a sense about following Jesus.
Right.
You're not really supposed to pick up a cross. Crosses are not being used these days.
Right. Thankfully.
But crosses were a very important part of Roman rule. You know, so it had a very clear meaning, very literal meaning.
Right.
But not obviously we need to think about what it means for us to pick up the cross and follow Jesus.
I agree. And I think it's interesting if we think about following Jesus in terms of a bigger picture of his ministry and how he went about his ministry, we find things like there were times when he was flipping tables and, raising his voice and getting loud. And then there were times when he was simply telling stories over dinner. And I think both of those examples can translate well into modern times. There are times when we need to get loud and make our voices heard and protest the powers that be. And there are times when we need to come together and have, simple dialogue and be invitational about our message. So I think we can even take his examples in that way, his actions, and translate those into modern context.
And I've thought that the example, he was so concerned with his basic message, which would have saved the Jewish people, that occasionally he got away from the crowd. But when anybody needed his personal, individual attention and help, almost always he gave it. And of course, the very interesting example of the Syrophoenician woman. He said, no, I came to save the Jews. Oh, but even the dogs get the crumbs. And I think that really got to Jesus.
Yeah.
It's one point where someone else taught Jesus something. And that's a good example, too, to remember we don't know it all. Yeah.
Jen and Jacob, let me ask you a question here. John, in his books and other process people, sometimes speak of what they call the faith of Jesus. So Jesus was someone who had faith in his Abba. And to have faith is not always to know what you're about or to have it all together. but it's to trust in some kind of spirit more than you, with whom you can cooperate. And so we in the process world, and probably you in your world as well, say Jesus himself was creatively transformed. Jesus himself was on a journey. For Jesus too, the future was open. He too was unsure at times. But we want to share in his faith. And that's a little different from following his teachings. It's entering into a kind of mode. Would that kind of language work in your congregation, or would that be destabilizing because it makes Jesus too human? Yeah, that's my question. But then I want to turn to the question of modernity right after this. So don't take too long answering that. I'm just curious.
Yeah, you got it. I think that language works very much. I think we've talked a lot about the Greek of the Great Commission. When Jesus brings his disciples, this is the first time they're seeing the risen Christ. They get the privilege of seeing perhaps Jesus back from the dead. And the text says that some worshiped him and some doubted. That there was this moment of both divine understanding of what was going on, and mixed with that simultaneously was this doubt. And so we use that language a lot with our congregation, that of course doubt is not the opposite of faith, but a very necessary component of faith. And that when we even invite our members, when members are taking their vow of membership or they're thinking of joining the church and they say, I'm not sure if I can sign on to all of this doctrine. And we say, that's completely unnecessary. What it means to be a member of a church is not a commitment that you have your beliefs in order, but that you are going on this journey where you will be worshiping, following, on mission, while at the same time doubting everything that you're doing. But the idea is that we're just trying to go somewhere together, and we don't know where that end place is, but we do believe that the way we walk and what we're trying to strive for, that's what matters. And so if you want to be part of that, then jump on board. And so I think that language really does resonate with people today, is that they can't say that they agree with everything. They don't want to. That feels inauthentic to them. But it does feel authentic. Go ahead, John. Yeah.
I'll just say it is inauthentic.
Yeah.
You're turning over to somebody else
Right.
your belief. And I find it among scientists too, with their sciences. They will believe what their guild teaches, even though the evidence is quite strongly against it. I mean, it's not just a problem in our churches. It's a human problem.
Right. And I think to your question, Jay, about would that make Jesus too human? I think actually it's the opposite. I think churches and Christians would really benefit and be drawn to the idea of Jesus being more human than a divine figure who never does anything wrong. I think that story of the Syrophoenician woman is a great way of humanizing Jesus, and he becomes this great role model for us, because if he's this perfect divine creature who never makes a mistake, then it's difficult to believe that we can also follow in his footsteps. And yet we have so many human leaders and role models who are constantly falling short of what we want to be. We can idolize someone and then find out that they are having all kinds of personal problems and doing immoral things. And so if we follow Jesus, we find that he's not perfect, but he's open to learning and growing. And he always is willing to change his behavior, change his mind, and follow where the Spirit leads.
And Brueggemann talks a little bit about this, is that we don't want a God that is certain, we want a God that is faithful. And that should be us too, that we don't want to be certain, we want to be faithful.
Let me ask
I think there's one story of Jesus sinning in the Gospels. You remember when he curses the fig tree?
Yeah.
I don't think there's any rational justification or any moral. He was just mad.
I want to turn the discussion just for a moment to another issue. So a phrase that you'll find in John's book and in a lot of process thought is the phrase ecological civilization. And another, a term, something criticized in John's book and a lot of process thought is something called modernity.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, there's a problem even deeper than American exceptionalism in a way. It's a habit of thought, a way of thinking, an outlook on life that's 2.5 centuries old. And it has a lot of dimensions. Overemphasis on individual at the expense of community, a segregation of reason from feeling, dichotomizing something called nature as different from, over and against something called humanity, buying into that duality. And also an economic habits of thought that what the economy ought to serve is something called ever-increasing GNP, rather than human beings and life on Earth. So they're all kind of wrapped up into one package, and at the Cobb Institute and elsewhere, we call that modernity, because you can kind of trace those habits of thought over the past 2.5 centuries. But one thing I've really been wondering is that kind of historical thinking in terms of kind of a really bigger historical picture, couple of centuries old, you know, is that operational in a local church setting? Or are those categories primarily relevant to historians and theologians, but not actually translatable into the mindset of congregants like at your church? So I'm really asking, can you imagine your congregants thinking something like, to follow Jesus today is to critique very wide habits of thought that we've taken for granted, otherwise called modernity?
Great question, Jay. And I think that's something that the church needs to do a lot more work on. I think our congregants would be open to the ideas of critiquing modernity, but don't have the language for it yet.
Yeah.
And I'm sure people have seen visuals where they kind of define anthropology with humans at the top of this ecosystem. And then I think that we probably have a lot of congregants in that category. And then there's this idea that maybe we're just in one cog in this system, but yet there's this third way. And I think this is what John is writing about, that we are an integral part of a wider ecology that we're in service to. And so I think our congregants in general need to do more work on that. This is just a silly example of it. Our church is really committed towards sustainable work. And John, love what you write about in terms of our role in promoting sustainability and ecology for all parts of the ecological system. And so we were planning for a church picnic, and we wanted to kind of push people a little bit on sustainability. And so we said, you know what? First of all, we should be having a vegetarian option. We should have people sign up to what they're going to eat so that there's no waste. And we should provide other meat options other than beef, because we know that beef is this great source of carbon emissions. Mm-hmm. And wow, it was so controversial. For a church so committed to sustainability.
Okay. Well,
someone blew up and ran out of the room and quit that board. And we just said, hey, wait a minute. We're thinking about this the wrong way. I think that's where modernity seeps in, to where we can't make these small concessions towards thinking of ourselves differently within the ecosystem.
Yeah, and that particular conversation I thought was really revealing, because it comes up against the tradition of doing a church picnic a certain way and having certain foods, and the idea of innovating and thinking about our context today, the real issues today, and small changes that we can make that actually make a difference when we're talking about 300-400 people involved, especially in a meal, right?
Yeah.
So I think having that conversation revealed to us that there's more work to be done, even in a very progressive congregation like ours. It's those small steps forward that sometimes are the hardest to make, but I think once you're on a trajectory, and now that conversation's been had, I hope that it opens the door to say, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. Having people make these small changes was fine, and people actually got enthusiastic about being able to do a small part. So yeah.
It seems like a silly example, but philosophically, it's integral to what you're talking about.
Oh yes. No. Until we really work on our diet and work on getting. None of us can become perfect. We're inevitably part of a very imperfect world. But when we eat in unsustainable ways, oops, okay. Excuse me. I make such a mess of holding my camera. In China, where ecological civilization is the term used by the Marxist Party and also by the government, it's possible to bring up issues of this kind, but they're not popular. One of the big problems in the world today is that as Chinese become more prosperous, they eat more meat. And whereas they were able to feed themselves on basically vegetable, they've always eaten a little meat, but the quantity makes a huge difference. They're eating many families are eating 10 times as much as they used to. And for that reason, China can no longer be self-sufficient in food. But also, I think from what you said, you understand that the effects of raising industrial creation of meat is one of the more horrible expressions of the devaluation of anything on the side of the animals that we're killing. It's utterly brutal and very destructive to the environment. I think it's methane that the cattle, perhaps all the animals create in such quantity. There are all kinds of reasons. And so when I've been in China, I've been trying to get them to think about diet. But people who have just arrived at the ability to pay for meat are not immediately receptive to the idea of not doing it. So I think it's a very important issue. Yeah. I'm sure it is in China, and I think it is for the world, because 1 billion Chinese, if 1 billion Chinese are vegetarian, one kind of future faces the planet in terms of food security.
Absolutely.
If that 1 billion people are vegetarian, there's a much more promising future.
Agreed.
Yeah. But it's true in the United States too. And but people don't like, I expect you could probably mention these things in a sermon, but if people get the impression you're really telling them if they're good Christians, they can't eat the way you want to eat, you'll get some kickback.
Yeah. It's a very sensitive subject, we have found.
Yes, yes.
And I think it also, part of that sensitivity goes back towards the individualism, right? Yes. I get to make a choice. I get to do what I want. I won't be told any differently, even if I have all this evidence, and even if I say that I care about these issues, the environment and animal welfare and all these things, I still get to make my choice, and I won't be made to feel less than for it. And that's a tough place to start a conversation.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So we have about 4 more minutes of the 3 of our group, and then we're going to open it up to everybody. So Jacob and Jen, let me ask you one last question and ask you to be relatively brief in your response.
Sure.
So if there is wisdom in John's book, and I think you think there is it preachable, teachable, singable, ritualizable, liturgicizable, because I know, Jen, that you're interested in liturgy and ritual and the whole person in the worship context, not just in preaching. And so I'm really wondering, can you imagine salvation, as John understands it, being part of what you sing and how you experience the liturgy?
Absolutely. You know, Jacob and I, since the pandemic started, have been doing a Monday, Wednesday, Friday digital devotion that we send out to our congregation via email. And we talk for 2 to 3 minutes about a topic that we feel is relevant. And while we were reading this book, we were both underlining and highlighting and starring things that would make perfect digital devotions, just small ideas to plant seeds in our congregants' minds that could lead to bigger changes. I think there's tons of sermon fodder in this book for pastors. There are so many sermon series that could unfold from what John's written on these pages. I think so much of what he wrote is poetic. I've underlined so many lines that to me feel very poetic that could easily translate into liturgy. We're planning on talking with our director of music and fine arts, who also is a composer, about bringing some of these ideas into hymns. And I also think there's so much prophetic thought that's in this book that I think will really translate well into conversations with Christian communities. For example, on page 76, there's so much great language about teaching people about animal welfare, particularly tying that to educating our children about animals. I thought that was incredibly powerful. There's information about prison reform that I think is something everyone wants to move forward with, but doesn't have a clear path. And I think there are great seeds planted on page 76 for that. Also on page 82, John talks about clean energy production and how that could move us forward, and also food and farming reforms. There's so much great stuff in here that I think Christian communities would love to talk about, and John lays all of the groundwork to have some really powerful conversations.
And that ties into the question that Bill just asked in the comment section, if anyone has that pulled up, about do we need to take similar risks today to achieve divine commonwealth? And I think that's the call of this book, that churches need to remember their mission is to establish this divine commonwealth, to bring God's kingdom, as we say in the Lord's Prayer, to earth. And so for us to be able to proclaim that message from the pulpit in all of these methods that you say, Jay, I think that's a powerful call. I feel convicted, I feel inspired by this book to make sure that everything we do is centered on that call and that mission. So thank you, John.
Even the term divine commonwealth for me is incredibly powerful. And, you know, we do struggle in the Lord's Prayer. We've talked about this with several conscientious congregants who say, I don't like the word kingdom, but I don't know what the alternative is. Some people say kingdom, but that also has some issues. I love divine commonwealth. I think that's a great term to start using and moving forward with.
Good.
Great. All right. Thank you so much.
Yes,
now let's open it up. Richard, if you could open it up to gallery view. And everybody can.
Gallery view is open. It's just you right now. We've asked them to turn their cameras off just while you're speaking, but we'll ask people to turn them on when they have a question or something.
Okay,
And I wonder if Bill Dodge has asked that question in the chat, and I wonder if he'd be comfortable elaborating on it. I'm sure there's something a little bit more behind it. Bill, would you mind unmuting yourself and elaborating on your question?
Yeah, be happy to. I happen to grow up in a church in Northern Virginia, and that church, like many churches in the South, went through the whole debate about how to deal with segregation. And the church I was in was very much probably similar to many others, that this subject sort of gets constantly kicked forward until you face the need to hire a new pastor. And so at that point, all of a sudden you're making choices between someone who is giving you a sermon that basically was fostering integration, and maybe someone else who said, maybe we're not ready for this at this point in time. Well, the church I was in made the decision to hire the pastor who really favored integration. The result was half the congregation left and went to other churches. But within a short period of time, only a few years, the congregation at the church I was in grew to twice the size it had been before
Wow, that's
that point in time. So, I mean, I was raising the question of, are we willing to take the risk to basically have to face the notion that our particular institution might disappear, but also do we have some confidence in the thought that following Jesus it can prevail in terms of saving the institution?
Bill, is that question addressed to John or Jen or Jacob or all three?
Any of the J's.
well, Bill, I think that the liberal church, if it can take a broad view, would recognize the only chance of a future is to take chances. Otherwise, it's dying. I mean, the statistics are all very clear. And if it takes chances and really becomes visible as the place where cutting edge work is going on, where people are really building a new kind of community based upon a different kind of thinking, I think that there are lots of younger people who might find their way there. But I've sometimes thought maybe we just need to create new institutions that are not able to receive money without and get it deducted, and have no commitments to being nonpartisan. Just communities of people who decide to be countercultural and separate. But I've been wonderfully encouraged by this conversation to think existing congregations can go a long way in spite of those problems. But thank you for a positive story. You're not going to guarantee that every time people do the right thing, they will be rewarded with wonderful results, are you? But sometimes it happens.
Yeah, our church has a similar history in when they decided to become an open and affirming church. There was a lot of concern and anxiety about people who would leave the church because of this issue. And the pastor at the time, Butch Henderson, made a statement that we might actually grow because of this. There might be people who will come to our church because we make this declaration and open the doors wide. And that is in fact what happened. And so I think we have to remember that often risks benefit the church, because by taking a hard stance on an issue that we feel is truly in line with the gospel of Jesus Christ, that actually is compelling for people who may otherwise have thought, I don't know if the church is doing anything relevant or important these days. And when we make a big statement like that, I think that does draw people.
Yeah, and that ties into chapter 7 of your book, it's community of communities, that this has to happen on a local level. I don't think we can get to the ecological civilization unless it happens locally.
Absolutely.
And make decisions like that.
Mm-hmm.
An ecological civilization is based upon local communities.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of the importance of the local is gaining a good deal of ground these days.
Yeah, the future of the church is in the local church, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the local church primarily is going to work in the local community.
We have 2 more people with questions now. Ignacio, and then Damien. In that order. Ignacio, you want to go first?
Yeah, I want to address the issue of the individual. I think that it was stated earlier that John wrote this against the traditional belief that we are looking for individual and personal salvation. And then towards the end of the conversation, we talked about the individual choice. I want to eat meat, therefore I'm going to eat meat. And I think that maybe the most difficult thing that churches can do is to preach against the supremacy of the individual. It's the individual in community that we need to really be talking about. If we're talking about communities of communities of communities, then we really have to talk about the individual in community. And that might be the hardest thing to do, to preach against the supremacy of the individual choice. I want to eat meat, ergo I'll eat the meat, that goes also for 1 billion Chinese. If we begin to teach them that about the supremacy of the individual, the earth is doomed if they become individualistic.
Yeah, if I can speak to that for a moment, I think that's really powerful, Ignacio. Thank you for bringing that up. There's a great movie that I would commend to everyone called The Farewell, which is about a Chinese American family whose, I believe it's her grandmother, is diagnosed with cancer. And so they go to China to basically say farewell. And she discovers that in Asian communities, and maybe some of you know this as well, you often don't tell a person with a terminal diagnosis about the diagnosis. And the idea is that you carry that burden for them, and therefore you often prolong their lives. And science has evidence to back this up, which I think as Americans we find shocking, and the main character in the movie finds shocking because she says, in America, that's illegal. Everybody has the right to know about their own health and their own body. And the idea is that different cultures think about individuality very differently, and there are times when it serves them in a very tangible way to think communally. And I think we're seeing this with the pandemic right now, right? Like
exactly.
Countries and different communities who have a more communal way of thinking about doing what's right for the greater good, the commonwealth, are faring much better than societies who are all about the individual. So I think even though we think about some countries like China, for example, as having to clear this great hurdle to overcome individualism, I think there are ways in which they're actually primed for it much more than we are.
Taiwan has only had 7 COVID deaths, 7 in Taiwan, with about 50 million people.
Right.
All right. Damien, please share.
Okay. Yeah, I'm wondering about what kind of conversation you think you can or may have had about a process relational God. Because I think my sense is that underneath the problems with a lot of progressive churches is that there's a big question about what is the nature of reality and what is the nature of God. And yet there is this process concept of God that syncs very nicely with what we know about the universe. So I wonder where that conversation is, or if that conversation is happening. And what do you think would happen if you were to bring that up?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. Great question, Damien. And I think this actually ties into the last question as well, as I'm thinking about it, in terms of churches have to deal a lot with the concept of change, that it's very hard for people to change, and that change is actually a grief process. That when you ask someone to break with tradition, or when you were speaking with modernity, to think about things different from the way we've thought about them in the past, they actually have to go through this process of grieving. And to help them through that, I think that churches have to provide them with some sort of vision or alternative to put their sights on to help them get through that grieving process. And I think that ties with what you're saying about the nature of God or the nature of reality, is that God is responding to the change with us and experiencing that change with us. And that when God is experiencing that change, God has some sort of ultimate vision that we can be aiming toward. And that's when, as the church, when our role is mobilizing disciples of Christ, we can say, okay, here's the mission that we think God has. And God is grieving through this change with us, or grieving this experience with us, but also aiming us towards this path. And so I think that language can actually be really helpful, because our congregants need the ability to know how to move through change or to move through a process. Does that speak to what you're thinking, Damien?
Yes and no. I think one of the problems in the research that I have done, that particularly millennials and Gen Z have, is that they just assume that your notion of God is an old white guy on a cloud, right? And so it's we call that rejector data. And so they're just going to reject out of hand anything that looks like a church, because they think that you have this very limited concept of what God is or what God could be. And I see in the process idea of God an open door. And also it syncs beautifully with what we know about the universe and how the universe works and what we know about quantum physics and so forth and so on. Again, the perception is that because you are a church, that you are fundamentally anti-science, which is not the truth. But again, if they have those preconceived notions, how do we turn that around? And I see that door opening with the process God.
That's great.
Well
Do you want
said,
to
yeah.
speak to that, John?
Well, this book, in a way, presupposes the previous book, which was on Jesus Abba. That is directed to those questions. And of course, I think how we think of God is extremely important. I think that the fact that the early church, and I don't know really when it happened, but introduced the idea that God is all-powerful, which is not a biblical idea, and which is actually the crazy idea, the idea that nothing has any power except God. So all of your sins are really committed by God. Nobody draws it out that way, but the word Almighty has come to be used more than any other one word to replace God. When people don't want to keep saying God, they say the Almighty. And so that's just an example. And it's very interesting that one of our friends has recently written a book entitled God Can't. And this book has been a great success, really amazing. And it just relieves people of the painful thought that God is doing this to them. God is, they don't like thinking of God as cruel, but of course, if God is all powerful, then all the suffering in the world is caused by God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
God has a marketing problem.
Yeah.
And that maybe part of our role as the church can be to market God better, to change some conceptions.
I think just to be, a little closer to the Bible. Jesus never talks about an all-powerful God.
Mm.
There's nothing that ever happens that only God is doing. God always is working through creatures. And the creatures have some responsibility. So it's just asking people, and also it's common sense. I mean, I like to point out, if in fact God is the only being that has any power, then the God has very little power of the kind they're talking about. Because if God makes things that have no power do something, that doesn't take any power to do it. It's the power of God, it's the power to influence creatures, to persuade, to draw us, to lead us.
I think, Jacob, when you say God grieves, that is certainly something that processed people believe, that God shares in the sufferings and the joys, but the sufferings. And God is affected by all that. And then when you say God has a vision, the question would be, how might that vision be realized? And the process answer, well, God needs our cooperation. God cannot realize God's own visions all by God's self. So I think there's language that to say God needs our cooperation, I don't know how controversial that would be in your congregation or not. People might say, but of course. But that's the direction in which all this leads. If I can ask, in the interest of including as many people as possible, John Fahey, you had a remark or a comment or a question?
Yeah, I can't start my video here, but I did just want to comment that, as the chairman of the Cobb Institute, I wanted to thank Jacob and Jen for participating today. And as a member of the church, I'd like to validate some of the things that Jacob said. I had my reservations about joining that church because some of the theological beliefs, and Jacob and I had a nice chat, and Jacob said, as long as you're in line with our mission and what we're trying to do, we can walk together and try to figure it out. And I was like, okay, I'm in. That's great. And lastly, I hope we can continue the conversation. And I've been part of Peggy Perry's book club over there, and in a recent book club, not recent, but before the coronavirus, there was a group of people, and we all introduced ourselves, and at least 3 people introduced themselves as hopeful agnostics. So the dialogue is going on there, and I think that's a tribute to both Jen and Jacob and the type of community that they've built over there. So as a relative newcomer to Claremont, I have to stop saying I'm a newcomer. I really appreciate all the work that you've done, Jen and Jacob. So thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank
thanks,
you, John. We're glad to have you as part of it.
Yeah, and I also think that Claremont, as our church, but also the Claremont community, is such a special community. It has so many elements of progressive theology, progressive social systems being both built and also improved upon, especially right now. And so I have great hope that we can be a beacon of all the things that John is prophetically talking about for the greater Christian community and the greater nation.
Work towards it.
Yeah.
Now, I can't see, does anybody else have a thought or a question or comment that they would like to raise or share at this time? I don't have a view where I can see hands raised, so I'll have to rely on Richard Livingston to let me know.
Yeah, I've been looking, and that's everybody who's kind of raised their hand, either virtually or said something in the chat. So yeah, if you have thoughts or comments, questions, the floor is open for our last 10 or 12 minutes.
Well, while people are thinking of a question or a comment, let me just say that I strongly support what John Fahey said. I've heard nothing but enthusiasm for you as a couple. I have not really had extended opportunity to hear you, or a little bit of that, but I think you are already very much following Jesus, and I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. What a compliment.
I have an observation, at least from my perspective, that I'd like to share.
Can you let us know who you are? And
Ron Jones.
Oh, okay.
I'm a graduate of School of Theology and studied with you, John, back around 81, 82. I remember Ignacio being there around that time, or seeing him around campus too. Anyway, my perception, and you can see if it matches your perception on this. I can remember growing up in the Methodist Church, and in the 50s and 60s, and even into the 70s, I would say, there was freedom to come to your own conclusions. Hear a sermon or hear whatever the hierarchy perspective is, but ultimately it was up to each person to make to come to one's own conclusions and opinions and positions. I see that disappearing, whereas now it's becoming quite polarized. And I see it in the Methodist Church in terms of what's going on today. Very concerned that they can't keep it under the big tent, that we can't do that better. And I think that it really has some real problems in terms of Jesus' teachings too, and Jesus' faithfulness, I think, to go to John's point. I think that when the church subsidizes disaffiliation, in order to make people be with people like themselves and how they think, I think that it just raises big issues. And I think that that would apply to the Lutheran Church, Presbyterians, I mean, other churches that have denominations that have gone through disaffiliation before the Methodists are you know, who are facing it now with the General Conference coming up. So I think part of it is if we're losing affirmation of ultimately people being able to make their own decisions. I'm sorry, I didn't put my video on, I'm sorry. But also, also that Jesus spoke to individuals. I mean, he spoke to crowds too, but it seems to me that Jesus' message was directed towards individuals in terms of preaching of the kingdom. So these are some of the concerns that I have, and I think it's not just in the Methodist Church. I think it's more broadly. I think it applies probably very broadly. But anyway, I thought I'd throw that out just for consideration and to see if anyone wanted to speak to it.
I think that one problem is that if you don't have a clear shared vision of what the ultimate goal is, that differences become, there's no larger context in which to settle the differences. You don't share anything more deeply. If everybody was really trying to follow Jesus, and some said, well, that means living a life of sexual purity and certainly never killing a fetus. And, you know, you can go down the kind of list, and a life of sexual purity certainly is not the homosexual. You know what I mean? You could have people who believe very differently, but if you understood that they were really sincere about reading this from the gospel, you could maintain fellowship with them, and they could maintain fellowship with you. But if you don't have anything like that underlying, then serious disagreements don't have much chance of living together in a larger community.
Yeah.
Jacob, you want to say something? Jacob, did you want to respond too?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ron. And it ties back to what you were saying with the pandemic, Jen, is we're really seeing that right now, kind of these ties to ideology, the inability to respectfully disagree with one another and to have dialogue. And I think that's a huge threat to the church as well, and a threat to the liberal church, is that we're so susceptible to falling victim to our own echo chambers as well. So I think we have to be on guard against that. And I love what you're saying, John, about tying that once again to the mission of if this is the mission that we are pursuing together, then we can talk about how to get there, and we might not have the same ideas, and we can struggle, and we might fail along the way. And if we fail, that's okay. We'll try something else. But let's at least be committed to this mission together. Maybe that can be our common ground. Yeah, we can't disagree until we have a common ground. And so that's maybe what needs to happen. And that's what we've lost, is the ability to agree at least on some sort of common humanity of something like racism's wrong. If we can't even have that as a tent pole, then that might get us into trouble.
Yeah, I agree. And I would say that this idea of Jesus inviting people into the kingdom of God, I really like what John says about it being at hand. I think that suggests that it's as close as, like, you could reach out and touch it, or you could do something with your hands to make the kingdom or the commonwealth of God present right now, right here. And so I think there is that link between the individual choices that we can each make about our own personal, salvation, the ways that we can free ourselves from the current existence and reality and work towards something new. It benefits everyone in the commonwealth. And that's why it is a divine existence, because it's a choice that we're making that benefits us, but it also benefits everyone.
Jen, all three of you, all three of the J's, John identified loving your enemy as a kind of cardinal dimension of a life in Christ. And he saw that as really different from what the people of Jesus' day were accustomed to. It's quite different from what many of us today are accustomed to. What does love your enemy mean in a culture of polarization where, I find it fairly easy to love people 3,000 miles away, but it's a little more difficult to love people 2 doors away.
Yep.
With the signs in their front yard.
Right.
And so I'm not being facetious. What does it look like to take that dimension of Jesus's call in this period of such polarization, and at the same time sticking to your principles, sticking to the vision?
Right.
It's harder than ever. I don't think I've ever had a problem preaching love your enemy until this year. And I'm uncomfortable with preaching it right now because I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea, because I think for a lot of us, we think, man, our enemies really suck right now. And they are so terrible that they don't deserve love until they can get on board and realize how terrible they are. I'm feeling that. I'm really feeling that right now. Mm-hmm. And I think what this conversation is helping me see is, once again, this is so important, but I think it bears repeating, that if we can tell our congregation, this is the mission that we have, and in order to invite people into that mission, we have to be able to love them. We want them to be part of this mission, and we can't invite them until we have some level of love for them. Even if they're not on that path with us now, we have to be able to at least invite them. And so if we can keep people's eyes on the mission, perhaps we can preach love for the enemy, even right now when we're so polarized.
Yeah.
I happen to be on the mailing list for Trumpites as well as, and it's something that I think would help if people really read the literature that they are reading. Then you could understand them much better. But my impression is people read either one set of literature or the other. And both are right in talking about how bad the other guys are. But their arrogance and self-righteousness is also very apparent.
That's interesting, because love your enemy there involves understanding.
Oh, I think if you love someone, you try to understand.
Yeah.
And that means try to walk in their footsteps, try to see the world as they see it.
And I think right now, some of the practical ways that I'm seeing people love their enemies are wearing masks, even when it's not popular, social distancing, even when there's pressure not to, staying home when people are starting to go out again. So I think we're seeing ways in which we're being called to live out what we think is best for the divine commonwealth, even when there's pressure. And I feel like there's some ridicule right now towards people who are holding fast to science and the information that we're getting about the pandemic. I
want to thank all of the 3 J's. And I want to thank Jacob and Jen. Jacob and Jen, you can trust that we have never had a webinar in which we asked someone to read a book, and they actually read it. and could even cite page numbers. And so you gave this your all, and you gave it so generously and so thoughtfully. And I think everybody here wants to just say thank you very, very much for what you gave to this.
Well, it was a great book, so it was an easy assignment. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And John Cobb, age 95, and not having written your last book, even though you sometimes say that, we're looking forward to more. And next time around, we're going to get that camera figured out.
I'm sure it's made everybody dizzy because I can't hold it steady.
Well, I think when the divine commonwealth comes,
Cameras will not be a problem.
we're either not going to need cameras at all, or they're going to really be more efficient.
We'll get it. We'll work on it as soon as everybody says goodbye. So,
Hey, thanks to everybody for coming today, and blessings to all. Thanks to Jen and Jacob and John Cobb in particular, but everybody with us today.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Jay.
Jay.
thank you, everybody.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
If,